When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. These words were written by the German Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his book titled The Cost of Discipleship, wherein he lays out his ideas of the role of a Christian in the midst of a secular world. The book was published in 1937. In 1943, he was arrested by the Nazi Gestapo. He was in prison for a little under 2 years. He was tried without jury as a conspirator in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, and he was hanged in 1945. The words that he wrote just 8 years earlier were eerily prophetic. Despite the freedom to travel, even to travel internationally as Hitler was growing in power and as his intentions and his desperation became increasingly more clear, Bonhoeffer never chose safety for himself. Rather, he continued to be an outspoken opponent to discrimination, to persecution, to this man that he publicly called the Antichrist. While many other leaders, both in the church and in the community, decided on silence and to fall in line, Bonhoeffer was determined to rip the mask off of this evil. Though he wouldn't necessarily agree with all of his writings or all of his theology, his words and his witness still serve as a challenge to us. He wrote against what he would call cheap grace. This is the kind of grace that we take or give to ourselves rather than the grace that is given to us by God. Cheap grace is what calls us or what kind of tempts us into assuming the name or the title of Christian without its responsibilities. It is baptism without discipline. It is communion without confession. It is Christianity without Calvary or the cross. He challenged Christians to suffer with Christ and perhaps even like Christ at the hands of a godless nation. Difficult times elicit a difficult message. But his message is nothing more than an echo of what we hear in our scriptures today. The prophet Jeremiah was called from the womb to be a voice and a sign of contradiction in this violent, perverse, and crooked generation. Standing at the cusp of utter destruction and exile, he risks everything, his comfort and his community and his companionship in order to preach this truth to a people who would not listen. He begins to understand the fruitlessness of this endeavor. He sees that his words are falling on deaf ears, and he wants to wipe his hands of it, to turn, to walk away, to silence, and to bury this message. But it remains imprisoned in his bones, burning like a fire in his heart until he can't keep it in anymore, and he has to let it out. Tradition would tell us that Jeremiah would eventually die for his faith, stoned to death by the very people in a country far from the ones that he so sought to save. 600 years he anticipated this cost of discipleship that is laid out for us in the gospel by Christ. It is a difficult to digest message for us to hear even today. Whoever would come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake, he will find it. Peter, in all of his humanity, just like Jeremiah in his humanity, us in our humanity, and even Christ in his humanity, wanted to sidestep the cross, wanted to avoid the pain that it promised. Peter, in a misguided love for Christ and a misguided love for his own life, wanted to propose a different plan, his plan over God's plan, like some kind of teenager who always knows better than their parents. And for this act, for this proposal, for this brief moment, he is no longer the rock on which Christ is going to build his church, but rather he's the stone, the scandal, the obstacle over which God's work in the world was going to stumble. According to our tradition there too, Peter would eventually die for the faith, crucified in Rome like the Savior before him, though crucified upside down because he didn't feel like he deserved the dignity to die in the same way. He passed over the paltry profits promised by this world for the sake of receiving that reward given to us by Christ when he returns in glory. But for this to happen, we have to trust that Jesus is who he says he is, and that he will do what he says he will do. If Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Is he still calling people? Is he calling you? And if so, what is he calling you? How is he bidding you to come and to die? Perhaps it is like Jeremiah and like Peter to pour out your blood like some sort of martyr for the faith. There have been many martyrs throughout the history of the church, and perhaps more in this past century than there ever has before. Maybe you are calling to be a martyr, but probably not. Perhaps your death is going to be more like that is talked about in the second letter by St. Paul, to be a living sacrifice. And maybe this is even more of a difficult death, that is, as it is prolonged throughout our life. Not to be conformed to this age, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. Are we willing to suffer the consequences? To suffer the consequences of standing against the crowd, of swimming against the current, no matter what may come when we do? Are we willing to die to worldly standards that measure status, security, and success, standards that tell us and measure how it is that we are going to arrive at happiness? Are we willing to die to that relationship, that activity that is a hurt rather than a help on the way to holiness? Are we willing to die to self? Perhaps the most difficult death of all. To die to my will, die to my plans, die to the way that I think things should be, the way I think I should be. No matter in what way the Lord is inviting us to this sense of discipleship, we have to read in this gospel that we are to take our crosses upon our shoulders. In no way does he allow us to determine the cross of somebody else and to place it on their shoulders. Those who are living in these Old Testament times, they believed that prosperity and fidelity went hand in hand. That if somebody remained faithful and obedient to God's command, then everything would work out well. It would be smooth sailing from this point forward, such that the prophet Jeremiah can yell out, "You duped me, Lord. You deluded me. You deceived me when things didn't work out as I thought they would." But we are no longer under such delusion, and we can no longer accuse him of deception. For we now know the way that Christ would walk and the way that he invites us to follow.